My hands trembled as I sat in the mahogany-paneled law office on Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. The leather chair creaked under my weight while I watched my son Marcus adjust his Armani suit with the same arrogance his father once wore. 23. Years of marriage to Richard Blackwood had taught me to recognize that look. The one that said I was nothing more than an inconvenience. "Thank you all for coming," Attorney Morrison began, his silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The New York skyline stretched endlessly behind him, a reminder of the wealth that had always felt just out of my reach. The office smelled of leather and old money, with its collection of first-edition law books and paintings that probably cost more than most people's homes. Marcus leaned back confidently, his Yale ring catching the light. At 25, he embodied everything Richard had wanted in a son: ambitious, ruthless, and completely devoid of empathy. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, checking his Rolex Submariner, the same model his father had worn. "I have a board meeting at 4, and frankly, this whole charade is unnecessary. We all know what Dad's will says." I pulled my simple black dress closer, feeling underdressed among the expensive suits surrounding me. Richard's business partners filled the other chairs, their faces masks of polite interest. They'd all treated me like furniture for decades, speaking around me rather than to me. There was James Wellington from the country club, Sandra Pierce from the charity board, and several executives whose names I'd never bothered to learn because they'd never bothered to acknowledge my existence. The mahogany conference table reflected the afternoon sun streaming through windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park. This same table had hosted countless business deals, merger discussions, and decisions that affected thousands of lives. Now it would determine my own fate. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat and opened the thick document bound in blue leather. The last will and testament of Richard Blackwood, dated March 15, 2024. His voice carried the weight of years spent handling the affairs of Manhattan's elite. I noticed his hands were steady despite his age. 60-something years of legal practice had given him an unshakable composure. "To my beloved wife, Helen Blackwood," Marcus interrupted with a cruel laugh that echoed off the oak walls. "Don't expect a dime of Daddy's $52 million, Helen. We both know you were just the housekeeper he married out of some misguided midlife crisis." His words hit like ice water, but I'd heard worse from him over the years. Each insult had been carefully crafted to remind me of my place in this family. That's when I noticed it, Attorney Morrison's slight smile. It was barely perceptible, but after 30 years as a social worker before marrying Richard, I'd learned to read people's faces like open books. Something was coming, something Marcus hadn't expected. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button and like if you're enjoying this story. The next chapter will change everything. Attorney Morrison's smile widened as he continued reading, his voice gaining strength with each word. "To my beloved wife, Helen Blackwood, who showed me what true compassion looks like through her decades of service to underprivileged families in the Bronx, who never once asked for recognition or reward for her tireless work, I leave the entirety of my liquid assets, $48 million in various accounts, bonds, and investment portfolios." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus's face drained of color faster than spilled wine on white linen. His confident posture crumbled as if someone had removed his spine. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible, above the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 20 floors below. "Dad promised me everything. We had an agreement. We shook hands on it just last Christmas." I sat frozen, unable to process what I'd just heard. $48 million. The number seemed surreal, floating in the air like a mirage in the desert. I thought of all those nights Richard had criticized my bleeding heart work with homeless families, calling it a waste of time that could be better spent attending charity galas where the wealthy patted themselves on the back for writing tax-deductible checks. "There's more," Morrison continued, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the tension crackling through the room like electricity before a thunderstorm. The Manhattan traffic hummed 20 floors below us, but inside this room you could hear a pin drop. Even the usual whisper of the climate control system seemed to have stopped in anticipation. To my son Marcus Blackwood, who has had every advantage money could provide but has chosen to use those advantages to benefit only himself, I leave my business empire, Blackwood Industries, currently valued at approximately $4 million after recent restructuring and debt settlements. Marcus shot to his feet so violently that his chair toppled backward, crashing against the mahogany wainscoting. $4 million? The company's worth at least 50. What kind of sick joke is this? His face had turned an alarming shade of red, matching his silk Hermes tie. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the perfectly controlled temperature of the office. Morrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and consulted a second document. I'm afraid there's been some strategic restructuring of assets in recent months, Mr. Blackwood. Your father made several significant charitable donations through carefully established shell companies. The Bronx Children's Foundation, the Homeless Veterans Initiative, the Single Mother Support Network, organizations your stepmother has championed for years without your knowledge or support. My heart pounded as the pieces fell into place like a complex puzzle finally revealing its pattern. Richard had been watching me, listening to my phone calls with other social workers, seeing the pain in my eyes when I returned from the shelter, where I volunteered every weekend despite his constant complaints about my wasted time. This is fraud, Marcus screamed, pointing an accusatory finger at me with shaking hands. She manipulated a dying man. She's nothing but a gold-digging piece of— Careful, son, Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that silenced even Marcus's rage. Your father was of sound mind when he made these decisions. In fact, he recorded a video message explaining his reasoning. Would you like to see it? Make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. This story is about to get even more intense. The tablet screen flickered to life, and there was Richard, sitting in his hospital bed just weeks before his death. Despite the illness that had ravaged his body, turning his once powerful frame into something fragile and skeletal, his eyes burned with the same intensity that had built his empire from nothing. The private room at Mount Sinai Hospital was barely visible behind him, but I recognized the window overlooking Central Park, where we'd spent countless hours during his final months. If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and Marcus is probably having the kind of meltdown that would make his prep school headmaster proud. Richard's voice, though weakened by chemotherapy and the constant battle against pancreatic cancer, carried its familiar authority. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the razor-sharp wit that had cut down business competitors for decades. Marcus stood frozen near the overturned chair, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist over the Hudson River. I watched his hands clench and unclench at his sides, his jaw working silently, as if he were chewing words too bitter to swallow. The other board members exchanged worried glances. Their golden goose was apparently not just cooked, but completely incinerated. Son, your reaction to this isn't a surprise. You've shown me exactly who you are these past 5 years, and frankly, I'm disappointed, but not shocked. Richard paused to take a labored breath, the oxygen cannula visible beneath his nose. Did you think I didn't notice how you treated the staff at the house? How you spoke to your stepmother when you thought I wasn't listening? How you've never once, in 25 years of life, genuinely helped another human being without expecting something in return? The camera had captured Richard during one of his clearer days, when the pain medication wasn't clouding his thoughts, but the disease hadn't yet stolen his final reserves of strength. He'd planned this moment carefully, I realized, timing it for maximum impact. Helen, Richard continued, his voice softening as he looked directly into the camera with an expression I'd rarely seen during our marriage, genuine tenderness mixed with profound regret. You probably think I never noticed your work. You're wrong. I had you followed for months, not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. Do you remember that family in the South Bronx, the Rodriguezes? When their apartment burned down last winter, you didn't just find them temporary housing through the system. You used our joint account to pay their deposit on a new place, their first month's rent, and you bought clothes for the children. My breath caught in my throat like a trapped bird. I'd hidden that transaction, terrified Richard would discover it and explode in his typical fashion of cold fury and cutting remarks. It was only $5,000 total, but to the Rodriguez family, it meant the difference between homelessness and hope. You did the same for dozens of families over the years. Always small amounts, always careful not to take too much, always thinking I wouldn't notice because you believed I didn't care about your work. But I did notice, Helen. I noticed everything. His image paused to cough, the sound rattling through. The tablet's speakers like autumn leaves in a storm. That's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. You were the person I should have been all along. Marcus slumped back into his chair, his face pale as fresh snow. Dad, you can't be serious about this. She's not even blood family. I'm your son. But Richard wasn't finished delivering his final judgment. Richard's video continued, and I could see him gathering strength for what came next, his fingers gripping the hospital bed rails with determination. But this isn't just about rewarding kindness or punishing selfishness, though God knows there's enough of both in this room. This is about justice, something this family has ignored for too long. His eyes hardened, and suddenly I was looking at the ruthless businessman who had crushed competitors without blinking, who had built an empire on the foundation of calculated decisions and strategic ruthlessness. 26 years ago, Blackwood Industries displaced over 300 families to build our flagship Manhattan complex on Hudson Street. We paid them pennies for their homes, literally thousands of dollars, for properties that we knew would be worth millions once we developed the area. We promised job opportunities that never materialized, relocation assistance that never came, and community benefits that existed only on paper to satisfy city planning requirements. I felt the blood drain from my face as if someone had opened a valve. The room seemed to tilt around me, the expensive furniture and oil paintings blurring at the edges of my vision. I'd never known this part of Richard's history, never understood how the foundation of our wealth had been built on the displacement of entire communities. Marcus looked equally stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air on a dock. The board members began whispering among themselves, clearly agitated by revelations that could expose them to decades-old lawsuits and public relations nightmares. I caught fragments of their urgent conversations. Statute of limitations, plausible, deniability, and damage control. These were primarily Hispanic and Black families in what's now some of the most expensive real estate in Tribeca. Families who had lived there for generations, who had built communities, who had roots deeper than our shallow corporate ambitions. Richard's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if confession was giving him energy he'd lost to the cancer. We destroyed lives for profit, and we told ourselves it was just business. The camera zoomed slightly closer to Richard's face, revealing details I'd missed during those final weeks when I was too overwhelmed by grief to really see him clearly. There were tears in his eyes, the first I'd ever witnessed in 23 years of marriage. Helen, Richard's voice drew my attention back to the screen with magnetic force. Your work with displaced families these past years, it wasn't coincidence that you were drawn to that cause. You have a gift for helping people rebuild their lives after losing everything, and I understand now why that passion burns so bright in you. Your own family was among those we displaced. Your grandmother, Rosa Martinez, lived at 247 Hudson Street until we bought her building and forced everyone out. The room spun around me like a carnival ride gone wrong. Grandmother Rosa, who had died when I was 12, heartbroken after losing the apartment she'd called home for 40 years. She'd spoken of rich developers who'd forced her out with legal tricks and intimidation tactics. but I'd been too young to understand the full scope of what had happened. Mom had never connected it to Richard's company, probably never even knew. The name Blackwood Industries was behind her mother's suffering. "That's right, son." Richard addressed Marcus again, his voice carrying the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. "Your stepmother is one of our victims, and she's been fighting to help families like her own without ever knowing the connection. That's the kind of person she is, someone who turns pain into purpose, who transforms suffering into service." Attorney Morrison paused the video and leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Blackwood, your father's final directive was very specific. Mrs. Blackwood is to use her inheritance to establish a foundation that will provide reparations to the families affected by the Hudson Street development and similar projects. She has complete autonomy over how this is administered, with one requirement: every family helped must be documented and their stories must be told." Marcus exploded like a shaken champagne bottle. "This is insane! You can't give away our entire fortune based on some guilt trip from a dying man." He turned to me, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You planned this somehow. You manipulated him with sob stories about your poor little grandmother." But I barely heard him, through the roaring in my ears. My mind was reeling with memories of Grandmother Rosa crying quietly in our tiny apartment in Queens, speaking of the beautiful home she'd lost, the neighbors scattered to the winds, the community destroyed by men in expensive suits who saw people as nothing more than obstacles to profit. Richard wasn't done with his revelations yet. Richard's voice returned from the tablet, but this time it carried a weight that made everyone lean forward instinctively, as if drawn by gravity toward an inevitable revelation. "Marcus, there's one more thing you need to understand about consequences, about how actions echo through time like ripples in a pond." His pause felt eternal, heavy with unspoken judgment and the terrible anticipation of truth finally breaking, free from its prison of silence. "I know about Stephanie Chen." Marcus went completely rigid, every muscle in his body freezing as if he'd been struck by lightning. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint, his expensive tan disappearing to reveal the pale, sickly complexion of guilt and terror. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered, but his voice cracked, on every word like thin ice under pressure. "Stephanie Chen," Richard repeated slowly, each syllable dropping into the silence like stones into deep water. "The 22-year-old intern you assaulted at the company Christmas party 2 years ago. The young woman whose family couldn't afford to fight Blackwood Industries' team of lawyers. The girl whose dreams of becoming an architect were destroyed because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself and your sense of entitlement in check." The room erupted into chaos. Board members began talking over each other, their voices mixing, into an incomprehensible buzz of panic and damage control. Someone mentioned calling the legal department immediately. Another voice suggested activating the crisis management team. James Wellington was already on his phone, probably calling his own attorney. I watched Marcus collapse back into his chair like a marionette whose strings had been cut, his hands shaking uncontrollably as if he had developed sudden-onset Parkinson's disease. I'd never seen him look so small, so broken, so utterly defenseless. All his arrogance, all his entitlement, all the swagger that came from a lifetime of wealth and privilege, crumbling in real time like a house of cards in a hurricane. "I paid her off," he stammered, looking desperately at Attorney Morrison, as if the lawyer might somehow throw him a legal lifeline. "She signed an NDA. This is all buried, finished, done with. There's no way anyone can prove anything happened." Richard's laughter from the tablet was bitter and cold, the sound of a man who had spent his final months planning the perfect checkmate. "Son, did you really think I'd let you destroy another innocent person the way my company destroyed families 26 years ago? Did you honestly believe I'd stand by and watch history repeat itself with my own blood as the perpetrator?" The camera angle shifted slightly, and I could see that Richard had notes beside his bed, pages of handwritten documentation that suggested months of careful investigation and planning. This wasn't a spontaneous deathbed confession. It was a calculated dismantling of everything Marcus thought he could get away with. I hired investigators, the best private detectives money can buy, people who specialize in uncovering corporate crimes and personal misconduct. I have security footage from that night. I have testimony from 3 witnesses who saw you corner her in the supply room. I have her medical records from the hospital, visit she made the next day. I have copies of the threatening emails your lawyer sent to her family. I felt physically sick, my stomach churning with revulsion and horror. This young woman, barely older than Marcus, whose life had been derailed by his actions while he continued living his privileged existence without consequence. I thought of all the families I'd worked with over the years, all the victims of systems designed to protect the powerful while crushing the vulnerable under legal technicalities and financial intimidation. Stephanie Chen is now 24 years old, Richard continued relentlessly, and she's working as a grocery store cashier in Queens because no architecture firm will hire someone who caused trouble at her previous internship. Her student loans are crushing her family financially. Her younger brother had to drop out of college to help support them. And Marcus, you've been sleeping peacefully in your penthouse apartment while she hasn't had a full night's rest in 2 years. Attorney Morrison cleared his throat and reached for another thick document bound in red leather. Mr. Marcus Blackwood, your father has left very specific instructions regarding this matter as well. Marcus looked up with desperate hope flickering in his eyes, as if his father might somehow save him from the consequences of his own actions, might provide one final escape route from accountability. He was about to be catastrophically disappointed. The remaining portion of my estate, Richard's voice continued from the tablet with the inexorable force of a final judgment, includes a sealed trust fund of $8 million that has been earning interest in offshore accounts for the past 18 months. This money will go directly to Stephanie Chen and her family, along with funding for a full scholarship program she will establish for young women pursuing architecture degrees at historically Black colleges and universities. Marcus's face crumpled, completely, all pretense of adult sophistication falling away to reveal the spoiled, entitled child who had never been told no in any meaningful way. $8 million? Dad, that leaves me with almost nothing. How am I supposed to live? How am I supposed to maintain the lifestyle you raised me to expect? His voice broke like an adolescent whose voice is changing, all his carefully cultivated boardroom authority stripped away to reveal the weakness underneath. You'll have exactly what you've earned through your own merit and character, Richard replied coldly, his dying voice carrying more strength than his healthy son had ever possessed. And Marcus, if you attempt to contest this will, harass any of the beneficiaries including your stepmother or Ms. Chen, or use your remaining resources to intimidate anyone connected to this case, the video evidence of your assault will be released to every major news outlet in the country, along with detailed documentation of every cover-up attempt. Your trust fund will also be revoked entirely, and you'll face criminal charges that my previous protection will no longer shield you from. I looked around the room at the faces of Richard's business associates, watching in real time as they calculated their own exposure and liability. They were already mentally distancing themselves from Marcus, probably planning how quickly they could remove him from any company positions before the scandal spread to them. In Manhattan's elite circles, scandal spreads faster than wildfire, and guilt by association can destroy reputations built over decades. James Wellington was whispering urgently into his phone, undoubtedly arranging for his own legal team to review every business deal he'd ever made with Blackwood Industries. Sandra Pierce had gone pale, probably remembering every charity event where she'd posed for photos with Marcus, every social gathering where she'd laughed at his inappropriate jokes. Attorney Morrison closed the tablet with a decisive click and reached for another document from his seemingly endless collection of legal papers. Mrs. Blackwood, there's one final element to your husband's will that we need to discuss. He's left you a personal letter to read privately, but he's also included very specific instructions for the press release announcing the foundation and its mission. My hands trembled as I accepted the sealed envelope marked Helen in Richard's familiar handwriting, the same careful script he'd used to sign Christmas cards and anniversary notes over 23 years of marriage. Press release? Your husband wanted this story to become public knowledge immediately. The Blackwood Family Justice Foundation will be announced tomorrow morning simultaneously in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and every major news outlet in the country. The story will detail the displaced families, Stephanie, Chen's case, Marcus's actions, and the systematic cover-ups. He's also arranged for interviews with investigative journalists who've been researching corporate malfeasance for years. Marcus shot to his feet again, desperation replacing rage as the full scope of his father's plan became clear. Helen, please, we can work something out. I'll change. I'll help with your foundation. I'll go to therapy. I'll make amends to that girl. Just don't let this destroy me completely. I'm still family. For the first time since entering this office, I looked directly at my stepson, really looked at him. This young man who had spent years treating me like an unwelcome piece of furniture, who had mocked my work with families in need, who had assaulted an innocent young woman and then tried to bury the truth with money and legal intimidation tactics. Thought about grandmother Rosa, who had died heartbroken and displaced. I thought about the Rodriguez family and dozens of others I'd helped over the years. I thought about Stephanie Chen, working in a grocery store while her dreams of becoming an architect gathered dust. I thought about all the victims of unchecked power and privilege who never got justice, who were silenced by NDAs and buried under legal paperwork. Marcus, I said quietly, my voice steady for the first time all day. Your father gave you 25 years to show him who you really were. Every choice you made, every person you hurt, every opportunity you had to choose kindness over cruelty, that was your choice to make. And now you have to live with the consequences. Hit that subscribe and like button. You won't believe what happens in the final chapters. That evening, alone in the penthouse apartment that had never felt like home, despite 23 years of living there, I finally opened Richard's letter. The Manhattan skyline twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a constellation of earthbound stars. But I barely noticed the view that had once intimidated me with its reminder of wealth and power beyond my comprehension. My hands still shook as I unfolded the handwritten pages, noting how Richard's normally precise script had become shakier as his illness progressed. My dearest Helen, it began. By now, you know the truth about your grandmother and my company's past. I've carried this guilt for over 2 decades, but I was too proud and too afraid to face what we'd done to those families, too convinced that success justified any means necessary. When I married you, I told myself it was love at first sight. The truth is more complicated and more shameful than I've ever admitted to anyone, including myself. I paused, my heart racing like a trapped bird against my ribs. The admission I'd both dreaded and hoped for was coming, the explanation for why a wealthy businessman had chosen to marry a simple social worker from Queens. I had you investigated before our first date. I knew exactly who you were, Rosa. Martinez's granddaughter, survivor of our corporate displacement, living proof of the human cost of my ambition. Part of me wanted to make amends through you, but I was too much of a coward to be honest about my motivations. I convinced myself that if I could love you, if I could give you a good life, somehow that would balance the scales of justice without requiring me to actually face what I'd done. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading, each word reshaping 23 years of marriage, reframing every interaction, every conversation, every moment of tenderness or conflict. Had any of it been real? Had Richard ever actually loved me? Or had I been nothing more than a living penance for his guilty conscience? But somewhere along the way, something changed. Watching you dedicate your life to helping others, seeing your genuine compassion for families like the ones we'd hurt, witnessing your ability to find hope in the darkest situations. You became my conscience, Helen. You showed me what integrity looked like, what service meant, what it actually cost. To care about people rather than just profit margins. The letter went on to detail how he'd spent the last 5 years of his life quietly investigating every family displaced by the Hudson Street Project. He'd hired private investigators to track down their descendants, documented their struggles with poverty and displacement, calculated compound interest on what true reparation should look like, and researched the long-term psychological impacts of forced relocation on entire communities. The $48 million isn't charity, Helen, and it isn't an inheritance in any traditional sense. It's payment of a debt that's been accumulating interest for 26 years. You're not receiving a gift. You're being trusted with the most important work of your life, work that will require every skill you've developed as a social worker, every ounce of compassion you've cultivated, and every lesson you've learned about helping people rebuild their lives after devastating loss. I walked to the window overlooking Central Park, the letter clutched in my hands like a sacred text. Below, the city pulsed with millions of lives, millions of stories intersecting and diverging in ways that created ripples of consequence across generations. How many of those stories involved powerful people making decisions that crushed the dreams of those without voices? How many Rosa Martinezes were out there right now, losing their homes to developers who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to profit? I know you're probably wondering if any of our marriage was real, if I ever truly loved you, rather than just using you to ease my conscience. The answer is complicated. It began as manipulation, I won't lie about that. But Helen, watching you live your values every single day, seeing you choose kindness even when it cost you personally, learning from your example what it meant to actually serve others rather than just writing checks to charity galas, that changed me in ways I didn't expect. You became the teacher I never knew I needed. The letter's tone shifted here, becoming more urgent, more personal. One more thing that you need to understand about Marcus. He isn't evil, just lost in a world that taught him that wealth and privilege excuse any behavior. If there's any chance for redemption in our family's story, it will come from the same compassion you've always shown others, the same belief in second chances that brought you into social work in the first place. But remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and healing doesn't happen without accountability. He has to earn redemption through changed behavior, not just words or promises. The weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a heavy winter coat. $48 million, hundreds of families seeking justice for decades-old wounds. A young woman named Stephanie Chen who deserved so much more than money could provide. And somehow, impossibly, a stepson who might still have a chance at becoming a better person if someone believed in that possibility enough to guide him toward it. Tomorrow, everything would change. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated community center in the South Bronx, surrounded by faces that had haunted Richard's conscience for decades. The building itself was a testament to what could be accomplished when resources met genuine commitment. What had once been an abandoned warehouse was now a gleaming community center with job training facilities, childcare services, legal aid offices, and meeting spaces for neighborhood organizations. The Blackwood Family Justice Foundation had distributed reparations to over 230 families, but today was special. We were dedicating the Rosa Martinez Community Center in my grandmother's memory. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, now 78, and one of the original Hudson Street residents, approached me with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. She had been Rosa's next-door neighbor for 15 years before the displacement, and seeing her here felt like completing a circle that had been broken decades ago. Your grandmother would be so proud, Mija. She always said that love wins in the end, but it takes a long time sometimes, and it requires people willing to fight for what's right even when the fight seems impossible. Through the crowd of families, community leaders, and local politicians who had gathered for the dedication ceremony, I spotted Stephanie Chen near the back of the room. She was radiant in a way that money alone couldn't create, her architect's portfolio tucked under her arm and her eyes bright with purpose. The scholarship fund hadn't just paid for her to return to school, but had also connected her with Patterson and Associates, a prestigious firm specializing in affordable housing design. Her first major project would be designing new homes for families the foundation was helping relocate. Homes that would be truly owned by their residents, not subject to the whims of developers or displacement by gentrification. Helen, the familiar voice made me turn, though I barely recognized the person speaking. Marcus stood at the entrance, looking older than his 25 years should have allowed. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple jeans and a button-down shirt that looked like it came from a department store rather than a personal tailor. There was something different in his eyes. Humility, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding what accountability actually meant. We hadn't spoken since that day in Morrison's office 6 months ago. The news coverage had been devastating. For him personally, but it had sparked a national conversation about privilege, accountability, and the long-term consequences of corporate greed. Several other companies had quietly established similar reparations programs after seeing the public response to our story, and Congress was actually debating legislation that would require disclosure of historical displacement cases. "I've been volunteering at a shelter in Queens," he said quietly, his voice lacking the arrogant confidence that had once characterized every word he spoke. 40 hours a week for the past 4 months. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to understand what you've been fighting for all these years, trying to learn what it actually means to help people instead of just talking about helping people." I studied his face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving performance. My years as a social worker had taught me to recognize when someone was putting on an act to get what they wanted. Instead, I saw exhaustion and genuine remorse, the kind that comes from actually facing the consequences of your actions rather than just saying you're sorry. His hands were calloused now, probably from manual labor at the shelter, and he'd lost the soft look that came from a lifetime of being served rather than serving others. "What do you want, Marcus?" I asked, not unkindly but without the automatic forgiveness he might have expected. "To help, if you'll let me." I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it yet. But maybe I can earn the chance to do better, to actually contribute something positive instead of just taking from everyone around me. He gestured toward the crowd of families celebrating around us, people who were rebuilding their lives with dignity and hope. These people lost their homes because of our family's greed. I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure that never happens again, and making sure that people like Stephanie get the support they deserve. Before I could respond, a small girl tugged at my dress with the persistence that only 8-year-olds possess. It was Maria Rodriguez, whose family I'd helped years ago after their apartment fire, now thriving in stable housing with parents who had steady jobs and hope for the future. "Miss Helen, Mama wants to know if you'll come to dinner on Sunday. She's making your favorite, arroz con pollo, and Papa wants to show you the garden he's growing on the roof." I smiled down at her, remembering the terrified family I'd first met, huddled in a temporary shelter, and then looked back at Marcus. Around us, the celebration continued with music, food, and the kind of community joy that comes from people who have fought for something and won. Children played while their parents talked about job training programs, legal aid services, and the affordable housing projects that would give them real stability for the first time in generations. "Redemption isn't something you can buy or inherit," I told him, echoing words Richard had written in his letter. "It's something you have to earn every day, one small act of service at a time, one relationship built on trust and respect rather than power and privilege." He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I know. I'm ready to start for real this time. Not because I want something from you, but because it's the right thing to do." As the celebration continued around us, with Stephanie Chen discussing architectural plans with community leaders and Mrs. Vasquez sharing stories about Rosa with young families who were just beginning to understand their own history, I realized Richard had been wrong about one thing in his letter. Healing could happen alongside accountability, forgiveness could coexist with justice, and even someone as lost as Marcus could find their way back to humanity if they were willing to do the hard work of change. Justice and mercy weren't opposites, as I'd always believed. They were partners in the long, difficult, essential work of making things right and building a world where everyone had the chance to thrive. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of justice, redemption, and hope. Please subscribe and like if this story moved you, and share it with someone who believes in second chances and the power of accountability to create real change.